Hello, everyone. This is Jason White, and welcome to our 10th ISO podcast. Our guest today is affectionately known the world over as the voice of the Indy 500, but in his new book, he's quick to point out the roles that many talented mentors played in helping him achieve that distinction. During a broadcast career that began on radio and continued on television, he's, of course, called IndyCar racing, but also many other series such as Formula One, the IROC, NASCAR, NHRA, the X Games, the Olympics, and many other international sports. He was recently inducted into the IMS Hall of Fame, a well-deserved honor that we heartily congratulate him on. And his new book, which is co-written with John Elrod, is entitled, Hello, I'm Paul Page. It's race day in Indianapolis, and he's here today to talk about his book and his life experiences. Please welcome to the podcast, the one and only Paul Page. Paul, thanks so much for making the time for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. A bit too much, but we're cool.
Congratulations on the book. I finished it just the other night, and it's a fantastic read. Not only full of candid stories, but it's a case in a lot of ways of you giving credit where credit is due, I think. Was that one of the main objectives of the book, to highlight the role that friends and colleagues had in your broadcasting success?
Yeah, well, there were actually several objectives. One was to pick up where a book written by Al Blemker stopped, which was in 1959, and pick up the history in 1960 and bring it forward. That was the frame that we used to build the tale, and then put in it not only some just historical facts of the results, but then tie all of that to my personal history and the people that I worked with. And it just, I wanted to tell all these stories about those great years. And I think it came out that way. I hope it did.
I think it did. The one thing that I can say about the book, and I've heard it said by people before, when you read it, hopefully you hear the voice of the person as they're reading it. And right. I mean, you have a distinctive voice to start with, but I heard your voice as I was reading the book, which was really fun, actually.
That's cool. Thank you.
Yeah. One of my favorite people that you talk about in the book is your great Uncle Harry, excuse me, and the pivotal role that he played in your life, encouraging your interest in the Indy 500. Do you often wonder what trajectory your life might have taken had it not been for the role he played and him being there to inspire you?
Actually, because you sent me some advance, I got to thinking about this.
Okay.
And it's hard to imagine what else might have become. Within that career, as you read in the book, I also worked as an advanced life support paramedic. Mm-hmm. That might have been something. My family was military. I might have stayed in the military. And other than that, I don't know. Maybe I would have tried to at least be part of a team as an Indy 500 team or something like that as a crewman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your son worked on a number of crews, correct?
Yeah, my son he's an engineer, a performance engineer for Andretti Autosport. And he's been there since he's in high school. So he has an aerospace engineering degree. So he's done, that goes back through the Team Green part of Andretti Autosports, when they actually started. And so he's worked with a wide variety of different drivers. But the most notable, I think, for him is that he was working the fuel calculations for the 100th running of the Indy 500 when Rossi won the race. And so the audio tape of the intercom, not the to the car radio, but the intercom over that last few laps is pretty interesting. Well, he's now working with Colton Herta.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right. Well, then I have one more reason to be a Colton Herta fan. There
okay.
Go. Excellent. Another key figure that inspired you early on was Eddie Sachs, yes. A driver that never won the 500, but was a fan favorite. What was it about him as a driver that made him so special, not only to you, but to many other fans?
Well, they called him the clown prince of auto racing, and they did that because he was always hilarious. He always had something funny to say. But I was attracted to him first by that. But then when I realized the passion that he had for his racing, and he'd do anything, go anywhere. In fact, I was just looking at an audio tape of him in an after dinner speech, and his after dinner speaking, he should have gotten 20 grand for an after dinner speech. He's so good. And he tells about racing, and he tells how much he loves it. And that captured me in 1960. And I love the guy. I wrote him at one time a letter, and I asked him, I said I wanted to maybe be a journalist or something to be involved with racing. And he wrote me back, and essentially what he said, it was on Champion Spark Plug 100-mile-an-hour club stationary. So that by itself was cool. And so he said, just follow your passion. And that's what I did.
Yep, that is what you did. So you set the goal of being the voice of the 500 early on, or at least, calling the 500 on radio. But along the way, you worked a lot of different jobs. You worked as a DJ at a jazz station. You were a movie theater manager, and you covered hard news stories, including one which is a hostage situation, which really was really riveting to read about. What are some of the key values and lessons that you took from these jobs along the way up to being the voice of the 500?
Well, to do everything to persevere. All of those were interesting jobs, and I enjoyed learning how to do them. Theater management, I don't know where that came from. In reality, I was looking for a job, and I saw the ad in the paper. So that's how that happened. But all of those contributed, like the theater, that contributed an understanding of business and how they kept track of records and everything, and how you had to account for your sales and stuff like that. So all of those contributed in some way to tell me how to go to where I was hoping to go eventually. The radio, of course, that I had always thought I had a talent for radio. And in fact, in high school, I was attending a radio symposium that was held every Saturday by a Waukegan radio station, and learning how to be a student journalist at that time. And I'm really proud that when I came back and started to actually work as a journalist, which was really to get inside the station that Sid Collins worked, and that really paid off for me, because as you suggested, I worked some pretty incredible stories. And I'm really proud of having been an on-the-street journalist, radio journalist in that era. And that helped me set everything up. And of course, it introduced me to Sid.
Yeah. And that's a great lead in, because the next question I have is about Sid, because he figures so prominently in your book as, your predecessor on IMS radio. And you talk in the book about how he and the others that you were around at that time, you really helped you to learn the sort of theater of the mind aspect of radio, where you have to remember that they can't see anything. And so you have to really describe everything like it's not just a yellow car, it's a canary yellow car, as an example. Right. And, then later on, of course, you became the TV voice of the 500, which is obviously a crowning achievement and fantastic. But were there times later on where you look back and you missed the art of painting that mental picture for a radio audience?
Yeah, I always did. It was funny. I've been talking with Bob Jenkins about that period of time, and he and I kind of parallel our careers. And the whole idea of, trying to phrase this properly, of coming to a team like that, preparing for something like that, bringing your passion to something like that, finally meeting Sid and having him decide that I was a guy that he wanted on his team, Sid Collins, of course. And then once you're on the team, a tide floats, rises all boats kind of thing. You you learn from everybody around you, and those were the best in the business to join that radio network. So I joined it in 1974, and Sid taught me a lot before that. He was my mentor. He was the one who said he wanted me to succeed him. And so all of those contributed massively to what I was trying to learn and trying to do.
Yeah, you talk about him as like, you mentioned very clearly that, a lot of people refer to you, as the voice of the 500, but for you, Sid will always be the voice of the 500.
Yes, absolutely. So, absolutely. Yeah, that's an important distinction. I know I've picked up the title, and I'm grateful for having done that. Mm-hmm. And I appreciated using it. Actually, both Sid, in his final words to me a couple days before he passed away, and within the broadcast network itself, they said you need to pick up that title. And I did, but I was very hesitant to do it. It felt like I was trespassing for the longest time.
Yeah, I think that's totally understandable, given the shadow that his tenure casts and the professionalism he brought to what he did. Yeah. He
was an enormous asset to the racing community.
Yeah. I'm sure that over the years, and you bring a real professionalism to every race you call, every event you do. But I'm sure there were some times where you were covering events that were pretty dull, and you had to really push yourself to get engaged. Like as a professional broadcaster, I'm curious, how do you prepare for situations like that? And are there tricks that you can pick up to liven up a situation that may not necessarily be the most lively?
Well, the key in all of that is preparation. Mm-hmm. You're going to have one of those. In say IndyCar racing, for example, you're often going to have it happen on a road course. And so you have to be prepared with a bunch of stories that you can tell while the race is in a dull moment. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's almost the whole race. Today, no, that's not necessarily true, but my day, definitely true. So you line up some stories, and I just made just little notes, the first line of a story or something, so I'd know what to refer to them as. But I didn't either memorize or write them down in total. I just wanted to remember there's a good story that I could tell at this point, and that's what I did. I always put a piece of tape on the counter of the in the broadcast booth where the monitors were sitting, and I had it hanging off with that piece of tape, that little list, and I just pull it up and I'll tell this story.
I would imagine too that there were instances like I've watched many of the time trials where you and the entire crew, Posey and Gary Gerald and everybody, and if it rained, I'll bet you guys were really glad you had so many pieces in the can ready to go, and the rest of it was just running around finding drivers and people to interview. At least that's what it seemed like on TV. So,
well, in television, that's absolutely true. In radio, we did have the advantage of being able to notify our stations that we were going to stop at such and such a time and return at such and such a time. Television, we didn't really have that luxury. So as soon as the rain would hit, I'd hear them yelling at Jack Root and all of the different pit reporters, and they would head off to interview drivers. But of course, since it's raining, and the drivers are all in hiding, but mostly in their garage. But you never know. You might get 5 of them in a room, back behind the Firestone tires or something like that. So they go looking for interviews, and we would have a number of features ready that were pre-shot and timely, and hopefully brought you closer to the sport in one way or another. Like we did a feature on Rick Mears. We asked him if there wasn't any auto racing, if it didn't exist, what do you think you would do? And he said, I'd like to be a Navy pilot. Mm-hmm. And so we set up an opportunity for him to fly in an FA-18 Hornet and land on the deck of an aircraft carrier, the USS Roosevelt. It was a great little piece. And we just did a lot of stuff like that to try and give you more insight and understand who the drivers were and what motivated them, and the teams themselves as well.
Incidentally, have you seen the Mears exhibit at the museum?
Oh yeah, I have. It's awesome.
It's
It's so
fantastic.
good.
Yeah, our previous podcast, we went there to look at the exhibit, and it was fantastic. It's really
Of
great.
course, I did sneak over to look at the Hall of Fame part, and they had already put my stuff in it. So I was like,
Oh yeah,
wow,
yeah,
this is making it. This is it. This is the top.
hmm yeah. Speaking of drivers, I mean, the one of the nice things about the book is that you offer your own unique perspective on a lot of drivers. The one that really stood out to me was your perspective on AJ Foyt. Uh, if you ask a lot of racing fans to describe Foyt as a person, a lot of them will probably go immediately to the Coogan incident in '82, or these numerous instances where he was either working on his car and very frustrated with it, or the times that he was angry on live TV. But you're quick to point out in the book that a lesser known trait of AJ's was his generosity, and I thought
Yes.
maybe you'd like to talk about that a little bit, because I think a lot of fans are not really aware of that.
Well, first of all, I never really got close to AJ. Robin Miller did, the writer, but for some reason I was always apprehensive about him, and I think it was my fault that I didn't get closer. But I'd been to his farm in Hockley, Texas, and things like that, and done a lot of things that involved him. But I didn't feel the bond there that I did with most of the other drivers. But I was well aware of the things that he did behind the scenes. And he has a huge heart. And there would be families that, there maybe someone in the family was killed in a racing accident or something else, and there'd suddenly be a check there. And wow. He'd take people under his wing and protect them and help them. And I always admired that. And I admired that he didn't really want you to talk about it. In fact, I'm anxious to see what he's going to say when he sees this part. I might he swung at Robin Miller once, so maybe he'll swing at me.
Well, I think it's refreshing that he didn't, publicize that, because yeah. I think it's fair to say we live in an era where people seem to think of philanthropy or being generous as some kind of a narcissistic exercise where look at me, look at what I've done. And that clearly wasn't the point. If AJ was being generous, he was doing it because he genuinely wanted to be.
He's the better champion for it.
Yeah, no, I thought that was a terrific insight. Also, speaking of personalities, we recently lost one that was much larger than life, Bobby Unser, a man whose competitive drive is always going to be the stuff of legend. And there's been so much written about his accomplishments on and off the track, but the book made me want to ask you about another of his trademark traits, his unique sense of humor and your experiences with that.
Well, he was certainly larger than life. He lived his life exactly the way he wanted to. One of the traits that irritated me about him is if he didn't understand something, he would badger me or anyone else until he understood what they were talking about. So I call that, he was intellectually honest. Mm-hmm. He'd admit when he didn't know something, but he wanted to figure it out. And no matter how complex, he'd beat on you until you made him understand what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And his great sense of humor, he was always, practical jokes were huge with him. And he was always pulling one of those. And then, of course, his time in the broadcast booth, primarily with Sam Posey, that just got to be hilarious because Sam would say something as black and Bobby would say it as white, and, with a, no, Sam, it's white. No, Sam, that's not right. And then he'd work his way around. So if it actually was white, then Bobby'd work his way back. So he would say it was white, but then Bobby had said it, therefore it is a fact and important. So it was hilarious being between those two.
How much of it, was it really the oil and water situation that it appeared to be?
No, not at all. I'll cite an example. Okay. One time on a flight from Los Angeles to Sydney, Australia, the two had seats side by side, and that's a 14-hour flight. And I slept through most of the flight, as I always try and do. But every time I'd wake up or the stewardess would come by or something like that, the two of them were talking. They talked 14 straight hours. Wow. And they were enjoying the conversations with each other. And I think they enjoyed each other's company immensely. They knew their roles too. Bobby would be the lead of the analysts in the booth, and then Sam would follow on, but they'd batter back and forth, and it made for really great television.
Yeah, I got the sense watching them that even if they really, really seriously disagreed on something, that there was respect underneath it all.
Yeah.
Professional respect.
I think that if there was anybody that was upset with me, it would have been more Sam, because he had developed certain broadcasting habits working for ABC so many years before. But before, when that was primarily a tape delay broadcast and they could edit out, I think it ended up as a 2 or 3 hour broadcast. So it didn't necessarily cover the whole race. And Sam kind of got used to that atmosphere. And then when we got to the live aspect of it in 1988, when I joined them, they actually started going live in 86. Sam had accrued some habits, like he would write notes on 5x7 cards, and he'd have a stack 3/4 of an inch tall of all these different notes and stories, but they were written out. He was going to read that card kind of thing. And I kept saying, Sam, you're going to get trapped doing that. That's not a great idea. Do it like I do it, just a hint of what you want to talk about. And so he kept it up. And so one day at the Indy 500, when he came into the booth and set down that stack, I picked it up and threw it across the booth. So all these 5x7 cards were on the floor, and we were almost on the air. So he didn't have any real time to recover from that. And he was much better when he did that. So hopefully I'm able to teach people something as well.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great, because everybody has their own little habits that they pick up, whether they're aware of it or not.
Well, let me tell you another one. Bobby had the habit first on of he didn't really try to memorize his on-camera open. He knew what he wanted to say, so he'd sit down with somebody and they'd write it out on file folders taped together. So they might have 3 feet of file folders taped together as cue cards. Mm-hmm. And that was wrong too, because if something happens that changes that whole concept, you've got to go with that. You can't just stare at the camera and read something that may not be accurate at that second because something just changed. So I was trying to wean him off of that, and he wouldn't do it and wouldn't do it. So one day I think it was at Michigan, on top of the grandstand to do our opening. We did a lot of them openings from the top of the grandstand. And I got the stage manager in cahoots with me. And so I suddenly said to Bobby, about 4 minutes before we were going to be on the air, since Bobby didn't pay any attention to that, I said, "Come on, Bobby, come on, we're on, get up there." And he, got in place and all that. And I started the open, "Hello, I'm Paul Page, welcome." And then I threw it to Bobby to answer my first question. And he started reading his cue cards, the file folders, and the stage manager let him go, and the wind took him off the top of the grandstand. And Bobby just stopped. And so I said, "See, things happen. You really can't rely on that stuff. You really ought not to do it that way. Besides, you look better when you're just talking and not trying to read something." And he paid me back for that in a number of different ways, but I think that helped him too. It was great to see his face. And of course, we weren't on the air. So, I finally had to tell him, "No, that wasn't on the air, Bobby. We're going to be on the air in like 2 minutes."
That's really interesting. And yeah, you're totally right. When you read something versus when you're saying it just off the cuff, it's
just different.
It's different. Yeah, there's a different energy about it. Still on the subject of drivers, there's always going to be this debate of who the greatest Indy 500 driver is, and we're never really going to settle that. It's always going to be an evolving argument. But I was thinking, how could we talk about this? And I was thinking, okay, let's take it from the aspect of like maybe some adjectives that could be interesting. Like, for example, who do you think, in your opinion, was the most naturally gifted driver at the
Rick
race?
Mears.
Rick Mears.
Yeah. Rick didn't really want to drive. He wanted to be a motorcycle racer. Mm-hmm. But from the moment he got into a car, he was just smooth as can be. He understood it right away. And his understanding of the sport and the facility he was racing in, all of that, he was just a total natural. And he talked to me, for example, about running a qualifying lap at the Speedway, which he absolutely hated, but I guess everybody does. But he'd say, I try not to move the steering wheel more than a quarter of an inch because I don't want the front tires turning and causing friction. And then one time he told me that he figured out that he accidentally spun a guy by getting up into his wake on the right side of the car.
Oh, yeah.
And, he saw things like that and understood them and used them to his advantage.
Who do you think was the canniest driver, like the most clever?
Well, I guess considering the rules at the time, you had to say Bobby, because Bobby would do things like, I worked the first couple of races in the North Pits, which is right near the pit entrance. And there were no speed limits in those days. And they'd go yellow or something, and here'd come Bobby, even under a green, roaring through those pits, primarily on a yellow. And, he's going past me like 160 miles an hour. But he'd pick up a position or two. Of course, he finally got caught for that. And many of his other antics, but he was always game in the race.
This was one of those instances where the pacer light system had a pretty glaring flaw, right? Because it did. If there's no speed limit in the pits, then you can pick up positions by just rocketing.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you've made that correlation, because most people don't. The pacer lights that we used to have, which essentially said when the yellow comes out, you'll see a number on an electronic signboard that they're spread throughout the track. And if you see the number 6, you adjust your speed so the next signboard you see number 6. And the intent was to keep the advantage that somebody had gotten. So if their interval was such and such, it would remain that until you went back to green. But of course, then with the pit stops and everything, that all kind of went away. And Joe Cloutier, then president of the Speedway, had thought that up. And finally, he realized that that wasn't really the greatest idea in the world and got rid of it. But yeah.
Yeah, because when you listen to F1 drivers talk about what they think about Indianapolis, one often repeated thing is they don't like the yellows because it closes up the field. And I think to myself, well, they tried, to do something that would negate that, but in the end, it just wasn't practical. So
yeah, it didn't work out. And if you consider that we are also an entertainment sport,
yes,
the fact that they bunch up and even though they bunched up, we've tried other things there with putting the faster guys on one line and the slower guys on another, to maybe give the slower guys a chance to mold into but in the end, in racing, the performance of the car and driver ultimately wins out. Like I used to drive Formula Fords, and I often I had to work on Fridays and maybe Saturday morning, so I couldn't go to the race on Saturday. I would instead show up at the race, like at Indianapolis Raceway Park or Blackhawk Farms in Beloit, Wisconsin, on Sunday morning, or at least the night before. So I had to go into the emergency practice session. And so that's where my time came from for my qualifying. And I was always put to the back of the field because you couldn't really go fast because there were so many other things on the track. And I hadn't been in an actual qualifying session. So I was often stuck in the back of the field. And throughout the race, you'd kind of move up to about where you were supposed to be ultimately. So I might go from, in those days, 20th to 5th. But that was where I probably belonged in the qualifying anyway. After that, now you're struggling to move faster.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You're right. I've heard people say that after races, like, well, I was probably going to end up there anyway. So
yeah,
it's funny how that works. What about, in your opinion, who was a driver that was very underrated, who didn't get the recognition they really deserved for one reason or another?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first.
Sorry. What about a driver who, in your estimation, was probably one of the more underrated drivers at the Speedway?
That's a great question too. And I hadn't thought about this one. There were a number of guys, especially if you go back to the old days, that probably should have won 4 500s, or at least one, and never did. In modern times, because it's so much team, all these drivers are really pretty much equal, except for the veterans' understanding of the race and the tracks they're at. So right now, I don't think you have any really underrated guy. And you have guys that are at the back of the pack, but you can't just say it's the driver. I mean, Jimmy Johnson, for example, he's a driver.
Yeah.
But the combination of him and his lack of understanding of this particular type of racing and the car that he's driving, they all combine together. And, someday he's going to go a lot faster, but he's working up to it. He's got so many instincts and habits that came from NASCAR that he's got to forget and learn how the IndyCar actually performs. And they're so sophisticated today. Like on a qualification lap, you're actually changing the anti-roll bars turn by turn and stuff like that, stuff that television doesn't talk about very much. And that is so technical, and television always told me nobody will understand the technical, which I disputed with them. But just things like that, they're so subtle in many different ways. You got a guy who comes from road racing, like Formula One, they're already kind of in the envelope. Or if they came up through the developmental series and came from Indy Lights or something like that, they've driven a rear engine high performance car and understand its nature. But if you're coming from a lifetime of running an entirely different style of car, it's very difficult to get in the habit of driving it the way it needs to be driven.
Yeah, fans watching him right now, I think, are thinking to themselves, he just needs time. He just needs seat
that's all
time.
he needs.
Yeah.
And when he gets that time, look out.
Yeah. And here's another tough question, probably. Who, because everybody's fun to watch to some degree, but who was the most fun to watch at the Speedway?
Well, I would first say Eddie Sachs within my reference, because he was always doing something, and as a driver, he really was great. But he was not a knowledgeable driver. He couldn't tell you what the car was. He couldn't be a driver today because he had no idea what the car was doing. They'd come into the pits in those days, and the tire engineers would at Firestone, they'd take the tire temperatures 3 places across the tire, and that would tell them how that tire was working. And then they'd pull the spark plugs and saw how the spark plugs were burning. And that's the only thing they had for the setup of the car. Because you ask Eddie, he says, I don't know. It's hard in turn one. Other than hard, what are you saying? No, it's hard. So, today, again, they are all so good and so understanding of the situation. And it's just really, again, hard to really answer that one.
Yeah, but there are a lot of drivers through the years who just drove naturally well. Like, for example, Ronnie Peterson was a naturally incredibly gifted driver, but didn't really know how to articulate what the car was doing.
Right.
So
Gordon Johncock was one of those.
Oh, really?
In the early days, as you noticed in the book, I worked on his team with Patrick Racing. And when the Formula 5000 came along, Patrick Racing, we entered it, and Johncock was a driver in a Lola, and we got to Mid-Ohio, and we're trying to figure out the car, and he's got no idea. I mean, you might as well have a blank dashboard on the car. But so they sent a bunch of us out to different corners and to count his upshifts and downshifts. And by doing that, they could figure out what gears probably ought to be in that gearbox, plus looking at other teams. But not a clue. Great guy, not a clue. Brave race driver, braver than most. But in terms of technical, no, I just get in the car and drive it.
Well, as eras change, also circumstances of the sport change, not just driving. And the part of the book that I was sad to learn about, I guess if I had looked a bit deeper, initially I would have realized, oh yeah, this did happen. But you and your wife, Sally, were really, casualties of the CART IRL split in a professional way. And that's yet another unfortunate outcome of that situation. which really disappointed me when I was reading about it.
Well, go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking to myself, and this maybe seems like an overly simplistic question, but looking back now in the split, which we all pretty much agree we wish had not happened, and we always think about what could have been, where would we have been if it hadn't happened. Do you think there's anything that could have been substantively done by Tony George and the owners or both to ward off that situation, or was it something where it was just an inevitable thing that would have happened?
No, I think there was a huge firewall there. Tony had some great ideas. I really liked a lot of his ideas. He was poorly served by the people that he had hired to carry out his ideas. I understood. He thought he was protecting the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, but he wasn't able to translate that into a whole series, though he tried desperately to do so. And again, the idea is like having competitive engines and several different tires and that kind of thing. I like that idea. I like the idea that the team is able to actually work on the engines they have and not just the engineer that takes it out of the box. On the other side, you really had a group of the owners who wanted the Indianapolis 500 as theirs in some way or another. They certainly wanted to control it. And they were always therefore fighting anything that Tony was doing because they wanted to look at their economic situation and their reference to the Indianapolis 500 in the Speedway. And so they wanted rather specific things. So it was inevitable that those two were going to go head to head. It's sad that they couldn't work it out. And it's even sadder when you think they did it at exactly the wrong time. NASCAR was on the upswing, and a lot of people just got so frustrated that they just said, "I'm just going to watch something else. I'm not going to be a fan of racing, of this style of racing anymore."
It's sad too.
Now, when you think about that, then Roger Penske's acquisition of the Speedway, I get to go together with a group of writers on Fridays, the motorsports writers, and some of the drivers. And, Roger Penske, we're thinking, if you really wanted the Speedway, you should have bought it back then. You wouldn't have to go through all of that. But I also, having said that, he's exactly the right man to own the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He can do things that Mr. Hallman could do that Tony wasn't capable of. Mr. Hallman was entwined in the national and global business world, which Roger is. So Roger can pick the phone up to a corporate CEO somewhere and say, "Hey, I need X amount of dollars, and I'm going to put your sign up here," and they'll do it. So he's good that way, and he loves the tradition. He loves everything about the tradition, the legacy, the history of the Speedway, and that's coming to front too. And it will make him. I'm wearing a T-shirt that has a picture of the urinals in the men's room at the Speedway, old long troughs that you can get from the IMS gift shop, but you have to do it by email or by a mail order. And he kept the troughs because we'd all talked about them for years and years. And in fact, I made a little video once for Channel 13, which fortunately they didn't air. It was a report on the troughs on a really, really slow day. That's all right. Economaki did one on a porta potty in a Formula One race in Dallas. So popular subject.
Actually, that's a good segue into asking you about the future of the series itself, because you talked about Roger and his taking over of it. I mean, as a fan and as a former broadcaster, what would you like to see the evolutions be of the series? Where do you think it needs to go? Because as you quite rightly point out, it's about entertainment as much as it is about the sport. So what would you like to see?
Well, first of all, right now, I love where the series is.
Yeah.
You've got great competition. I mean, and you got especially these younger drivers who can put the car anywhere with ease. I mean, they don't seem to understand they might wreck, and nor do they necessarily care. They'll get side by side, they'll bump tires, they'll bump one another front and rear. That's good entertainment as well as exciting racing. So I think we are really at maybe one of the best times in history for the sport as a visual entertainment. I would like to see, though I understand fully it's not financially practical, but I would love to see it get to Tony's idea of like multiple engines that you can work. Some of them you can work on yourself, and a few things I'd like to see on road courses, especially them have not just one alternate tire, but several, like Formula One, because then the whole race concept would be much more interesting, and the tactics and. But then I also understand everything, and I'm talking about has to do with something economic and financial. And right now, and for the considerable future, I don't see loads of money coming in to IndyCar racing. I mean, they're good now. They got a lot of money coming in, but to do some of the things that I'd like to see, they're down the road.
Well, one other thing that I'd like to ask you, and it's kind of just like more of a sum up question, but looking back at your experiences in the booth and the people you've worked with and learned from, what do you think it takes to succeed at the level you've reached? And by that level, I mean, speaking to literally millions of people all over the world as your audience, like how much of that is natural talent and how much of it is meticulous preparation that usually goes unnoticed by the average viewer?
Well, you're right. A lot of it is meticulous preparation. And seeking out those stories, going and talking with the drivers and the crews and trying to find out what's happening here or there. And I always thought that I was able to talk their language. And moreover, I had their trust. So they might tell me, we're going to try this in this race. If it works, you can talk about it. Otherwise, don't say anything to anybody. And that worked for me. But I go back to what Eddie Sachs said at the beginning, passion. You love it. You have to love it. And if you love it, it's going to just carry you on. And I think that's what happened to me. I love it. I still love it. I watch races, go to races. The passion is there. The urge, though, early on to also persevere. Those two things really, really drove me. And I think they drive, I know they drove Bob Jenkins, and I think that drives a lot of people. And it's necessary to really enjoy what you're covering, because if you don't, the audience is going to see that. They're going to see that you're not phoning it in, but you don't have the connection with the sport that many of the fans do, and they'd like to see a connection.
Yeah, you mentioned Bob Jenkins. We're all thinking about him right now.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, but our hearts are with him, and we hope he's doing all right.
He's suffering badly right now, and I'm very worried about him.
Well, we're all thinking about him, and we're hoping for the very best for him. But I can't thank you enough for your time, Paul, today. I mean, it's you brought so much joy to so many fans over the years, and you've been an ambassador for the sport, and we really owe you in that concern, because the sport thrives today in large part by you helping it along at a bunch of very critical steps, and we're really grateful for that. So, but thank you for your time today and your insights. And the book is called Hello, I'm Paul Page. It's Race Day in Indianapolis. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I would encourage our members to pick up a copy, because it is a really great read. Thank you so much for putting this on paper and sharing your story. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for the kind compliments. I'm just a guy that followed his passion, and it worked out.
It did. All right. Well, thank you, Paul. And then for myself, Jason White, so long from this podcast. We'll see you on our next one. Everyone take care and be safe.